Hello, friends. Welcome back. Here we are, episode 2 of Dr. Russell's Quarantine Book Club, season 2, with the number one ladies detective agency, with T, which is very important. So this video, we're getting into the nitty gritty of the story and the history of our characters, and I want us to cover three basic themes here. So our first theme is past versus present. Our second theme is tradition versus modernity. And our third is gender. And I'm going to get into what I mean by all of those things in just a second. So chapter 2 gives our protagonist, anyway, a history, right? So how does she become the number one lady detective in Botswana? But also, like, how does she become Mma Ramotswe, who she is? Every fictional character has a backstory. We don't always have the privilege of knowing what it is. But in this case, we do. Alexander McCall Smith gives us the whole tea, the full story in the second chapter. And so we get it all at once, quick. It's like being hit in the face. And it is rough, as we learn. So let's start with past versus present, our first theme, right? Chapter 2 is written actually in the voice of her father, which I find to be really, really interesting, right? So her father loves Botswana. He loves his country in the same way that she does, but he doesn't grow up in a free Botswana. Botswana was a protectorate, and not a colony, but a protectorate of the British Empire. However, it doesn't mean that they don't experience all the devastation that comes with colonization. So he doesn't live in Botswana, in a free Botswana. He goes to South Africa at 18, and he works in the mines, which is an extremely dangerous job. So he's faced with this very violent colonial context already, a dangerous and deadly job on top of that. And then he encounters, right, this violence in between different cultural groups and violence that happens from the white colonial powers who are the bosses at the expense of the workers. And so this is his experience, right? And I think it's so interesting because, in a way, Mma Ramotswe becomes really bonded with her father in the sense that later, and we'll talk about this in a second, her freedom gets taken away from her by her husband through violence and through control in the same way. And they kind of become each other's safe place from both of those things, right? Her father dedicates his life to her, and then she later in his life dedicates her life to him. And I think that that's this really great connection between the two of them. And again, it connects past and present, their relationship. And it also connects this like institutional unfreedom, i.e., colonialism, with her own sort of personal unfreedom. So her entire marriage, right, the whole thing happens without her consent. And she has no power and no freedom in that situation. And that also goes with our second theme, right, of tradition versus modernity. So the family in almost every culture, right, is the center of usually where our tradition is, where our traditional values lie. And what the family looks like has a lot to, or what we think it should look like has a lot to do with what our traditions and our values say we should be doing. But they don't, like, tragedy kind of takes that traditional family away from them. So her mother dies. So this poor man has gone through all of this travesty in the mines. He kind of flees them because of a fear of violence. And then his wife dies, and the mother of his only child dies. But then his cousin comes, right? And her husband done left her. And, she moves in, and because she cannot have children, her husband leaves her because she cannot have children. And she dedicates all of her energy to Precious, to Mma Ramotswe. I always like to point out that, like, we always think about and treat families as though it is a mother, father, and children, right? White picket fence, blah, blah, blah. Most people's families don't look like that. A cousin helping to raise a child when her mother has died is not unusual. People's grandmas and aunties and big mas and, those folks move in and live with people all the time. And so I think there's already this like break with tradition and Mma Ramotswe, little baby Precious Ramotswe, right, gets to see, she gets to experience and imagine a life that looks different than what a traditional family is, right? So they have this modern family in the middle of what is really a cultural shift in terms of tradition versus modern. And we're going to see that in this book over and over and over again. And this chapter kind of sets a grounding for that, right? In her past, in her history. So together, the cousin and little baby Precious break tradition, right, for what it means to be a woman. So gender is also something that is cultural. Um, so I've created a little saying, like, I think that they kind of were on this path of like books, not boys. I may or may not be saying that because that is my life. But anywho, she like raises Precious to be brilliant. That is her goal. This child will be smart, and she succeeds in that. And they talk about it, right? That traditionally intelligence is not the number one value for women in Botswana, but the cousin makes it the number one value for Precious, who is not pressed by boys at all. So they tell this story, this poor child, the story about this boy like exposing himself to her at Sunday school, Jesus. Why am I always saying Jesus whenever we're talking about church? This is what happens when you do things in one take and refuse to edit and be fancy. Anyway, and so she tells the Sunday school teacher, like, she is not here for any of this at all. Little baby or grown Precious either, as we will find out. But let's pause for a second and define gender. So gender, and this is my own definition ish, compiled from a bunch of different places, but for the purposes of our conversation, right? Gender, these are these culturally specific, which means they change depending on location, right? Culturally specific codes of behavior, of language, of dress, and of ways of relating to each other, and expectations, right, that represent supposed distinctions between categories that we call men and women. Although I don't want to not include trans and gender non-binary folks in this concept of gender, right? But unfortunately, we live in a society that, even when talking about trans and non-binary people, cannot figure out how to do so without relying on this gender binary between men and women. Binary as in only two. So, but the thing about gender, right, is that ideas about gender change over time. I'm sure many of you have heard the kind of fun historical fact, right, that high heels were originally made for men, and now they're made for women. Things change all the time. And so Mma Ramotswe is coming of age in this moment when that shift is happening. And there's a lot of tension that happens when people don't like change. I'm sure you have figured that out in life. But these things are changing in Botswana, and so she's kind of coming of age and sort of, in a way, being forced to make a choice, right, between one or the other. And then she makes one choice, and then she makes the other one. Let's put it that way. So she meets her husband, who is apparently, she sees him on the bus, and he is just a beautiful man, and he is a musician, and he invites her to be a guest at his performance, because she has basically hopped off this bus and decided wherever this man was going, she was going to go. When I'm sure she'd wish she had turned back, but such is life. So, Note Makoti is his name. Note that naming, just a quick thing about naming, her name is Precious, and she is essentially, right, the most precious thing to her father and to her cousin, or her father's cousin. He is a musician. His name is pronounced Note, but it looks like note, right? Like a music note. They have a whirlwind romance. The romance part doesn't last very long, and he essentially is like, "You're gonna be my wife." He sexually assaults her, right? He takes away, again, her freedom of choice to make choices about her own body through violence. She gets pregnant. He beats her terribly and sends her to the hospital. And when she comes back, this man done ran off with all his belongings. And hers too. He took the curtains, child. I was so mad about that. She had those beautiful yellow curtains from her cousin's house that she loved so much, and he took her yellow curtains. I was mad about that, to be honest. Anyway, so she essentially finds refuge with her father. So she is pregnant. She has a baby, and then the baby dies 5 days after it's born. And so she loses her child in the way that, and her freedom in the way that her father lost his wife and lost his freedom. And so she returns to her father's house and she opens this detective agency after he passes away, after dedicating her time to caring for him, again, in that safe space. And like, her dad is such a fascinating character because even though he is of the age where tradition, it would not be surprising, I'm sure, to any of us that he clings to these traditional things. He's totally, that would make total sense for a man of his age. But he doesn't. He was like, you don't have to get married to him or anyone if you don't want to. And yet she still feels this pressure, which I think is also important, right? That even though her dad is telling her that, she doesn't have to. Still, she feels this kind of pressure to do it anyway. And, she says she kind of wants to and she doesn't want to. She knows he's a bad man, but she wants to marry him anyway. And, whew, love. Anyway. And then I find it fascinating that she opens this. Then we kind of meet briefly Mma Ramotswe, who is my favorite character in the whole book, but we'll see a lot of her personality later. But she is a widow. And so you have this woman whose husband has run off, you have this woman whose husband has died, and these are two women who, just by circumstances of their life, are completely not reliant on men at all. And they open a business, and that business becomes successful together. But just in case we had gotten really invested in this very sad story about her daddy and her marriage and people dying and running off and babies losing children and all that, this is a detective novel. And so there is another case that we must solve. So we cosplayed in our last chapter as a nurse so we could get Happy Vipetzi's fake daddy out of her house. And now we got another, a woman, she comes in and Mma Ramotswe, and she's like, my husband is gone. He went to church and never came back. And then we get our first red herring. Ding, ding, ding. I wish that this is the times I wish I could edit, because then I would put some like really flashy animation right here for our first red herring. Red herring is our detective novel vocabulary word. Just a reminder, it means, at least in the context of literature and a detective novel, it is sort of a detail in the novel that takes us in a different direction than what's really happened, the audience, right? So it sets up that unexpected conclusion. And the red herring is that we think, and I think this is accurate, like she comes in and she's like, look, he joined this new church that I was not really down with, so I didn't ever go. And Mma Ramotswe is in her mind is like, so he didn't run off with the younger church lady. I'm also assuming he ran off with the younger church lady, so that makes sense. So I'm waiting for the love triangle drama to unfold. When in fact, this man has been eaten by an alligator while he was being baptized. What are the odds? So that is case number 2. And then chapter 6 gives us a wonderfully suspenseful setup for case number 3, which we will talk about in our next episode. But a young and very tiny boy has been kidnapped, and we will find out next episode what happens with that. But in the meantime, I hope y'all are enjoying reading, and we will see each other again soon. Bye.